This presentation is hosted by Kelly Hinkle, a Geek Girl Con staffer, from her kitchen. She'll be introducing Dr. Cyrus, who is wearing some really fun orange glasses. Dr. Cyrus will be showing slides on the left side of the screen explaining how her geek pride helped her awesome STEM career.
So hello, everybody. Welcome to Geek Girl Con. So I'm so excited to be here today with Dr. Cyrus. She is a board-certified psychiatrist who sees patients part-time in a community setting in Washington, D.C. Through her company, Dynamics of Difference, she also offers consultation on managing conflicts stemming from identity differences. She is also a respected leader in highlighting the ways in which discrimination impacts health through her political work with the Committee to Protect Medicare, advocacy as a founding member of Time's Up Healthcare, academically as an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins Medicine, and in the mainstream media using videos, op-eds, and speaking engagements. Welcome, Dr. Cyrus.
Thanks for having me. Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Cyrus, and I'm going to talk about how developing pride as a geek has helped me make a career in the STEM sciences, or STEM. So who am I and why should you trust me? So first of all, I am a psychiatrist. I'm actually a doctor. I see patients in Washington, D.C., patients who have insurance, and then those who don't have insurance who are really sick. We actually go out to their homes. That's how sick they are. We find them on the streets and meet them where they are. I'm also an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins Medicine. So that means that I'm affiliated with Johns Hopkins Medical Center. I get to be part of their academic community. I use their library. I can go to talks and present under that name. I also started my own consulting business a couple years ago, which I've called Dynamics of Difference. Through this business, I do some speaking engagements. I make videos. I also do, I work with organizations or groups that want to take a deeper dive at some of their issues that might be going on because people who work for them have different identities, and that's causing conflict. I also am a board member of the Committee to Protect Medicare. So essentially, this is a political organization that is run by doctors, and we're getting doctors in front of the camera in their state and their local news to talk about how we can protect healthcare by who we vote for, and also to correct misinformation that might be out there about how COVID-19 might be spread and what we can do to avoid the spread of it. And then lastly, I'm a founding member of Time's Up Healthcare. So Time's Up is the organization that launched the Me Too movement that was actually started by Tarana Burke, who's a Black woman, and then made sort of a bit more bigger and well known through Time's Up Hollywood. And so we have a healthcare branch, which I'm a member, and this is to bring awareness to gender and racial equity in the healthcare field. So one of the reasons why I'm here and talking to you guys is just to tell you my path. And I want to start by, talking about my mother. That's where most people's paths start, whether or not you know your mother or not. And this happens to be mine. Her name is Geraldine. She was born in a completely different time than I was, in the 50s, grew up in rural South Carolina, and was always taught herself, and she taught me, don't trust anyone to stand up for you. And so you can imagine what that's like, having a mother who's kind of grown up with this lens. And there were a lot of restrictions on who I could hang out with, who I should trust, specifically not to trust people who look like me. The only thing is that my mother also was like, I want you to be a doctor, which is a little tough, right? Because you can imagine that there weren't a lot of brown kids or Black kids in classes to be a doctor. And then you have your mother who's telling you not to trust people who look like you when there are not a lot of people like you. So who do you trust? Regardless, as a child, and your mom says, I want you to be a doctor. This is baby Callie or elementary school Callie. I'm going to go ahead and say, okay, yeah, mom, I want to be a doctor. So that's sort of how this all started, is that my mother really wanted me to be a doctor. And I sort of thought I wanted to be a doctor too. More will come on this later. But as it turns out, and I'm sure most of you might know this by now, it's really hard to be Black and become a doctor. So I know this is a very stretched out graph, but this shows the percentage of all active physicians by race and ethnicity. And this is actually as of 2019. As you can see, 5% of them are Black or African American, right? So it's 5%. If we're talking about women, that's actually like 2%. And those numbers have not changed over at least 5 to 10 years. So again, how do you beat the odds of becoming a doctor when you're already set up, to be like a 2% according to these numbers? Also, I didn't know any doctors, right? So by the time I decided I wanted to be a doctor, I had my parents. My father had only finished high school. He worked as a truck driver. My mother had actually gone back to college and got finished her bachelor's that way, but it spent most of her time at home after recovering from and being in remission from cancer. And there's nobody in my family with a doctorate degree. And to my knowledge, I had a cousin who I know had a master's degree. So this was definitely like, who is going to guide me through this path? And somehow, I don't know how my mother knew how to do these things, but she used to make me do all kind of things to sort of make my application look good for wherever I was doing. And when I say all kinds of things, she made me do book reports. So if you can see this is Ben Carson. I don't think we want to talk anymore about him, but he is a neurosurgeon and wrote this book way back in the day. My mom made me do a book report on him. My mom entered me in oratorical contests. So she made me do these speeches for Martin Luther King Day. I'd have to memorize them and say them in front of people. And she also enrolled me in multiple team sports. So I was a busy kid. And looking back, these are actually some of the things that got me to the point to where I am. I always had a well-rounded persona in my applications, starting with applying to college. So there's also an opportunity I want to talk about. And this is actually, I think, the opportunity that is, I like to say, is kind of responsible for my career, besides my mother who had me. And that's a pipeline program. So pipeline programs are those that are open to usually children or high school students. I happen to have started this when I was 13 years old. And they essentially give you experience in a field so that you can see if you enjoy it as a child. And they teach you sort of what you'll need to actually get through it. So I was in a program that flew me from Florida, where I grew up, to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where I worked and did lab research every single summer. And every summer, they also taught us about what kind of scores we would need to get into test scores to get into medical school, what were the best colleges for underrepresented minorities like myself, and giving you summers of bench research so that when you applied to college, you look like a superstar. And it just so happened that the person who invited me to be in this program was my 8th grade librarian. So that's how early this all started. And that's how like happenstance it kind of was. She just knew that I was one of the students who got good grades, and I was also Black, and she knew that there was a program that I could participate in. So that being said, they do have these programs, even if you're not necessarily an underrepresented minority, but if you're a woman, because we want to boost the number of women and minorities who go into STEM fields. So this was one of the main reasons that I think helped me solidify my interest in medicine. So even though my mother wanted me to be a doctor, and I sort of thought that was the reason I wanted to be a doctor, I actually did have an interest and a background and understood what I was getting into. So then I'll say the key opportunity that I think also helped me launch my career was going to Stanford. And while not everyone has to go to Stanford. This is one thing I really want to drive home. So why I'm highlighting this is because of what Stanford actually helped me do. So you can see here, Stanford sort of prides itself on being the nerds, right? So while our, mascot is a tree, we sort of have this other, mantra of saying nerd nation, fear the nerd. And I think it was the first time I left home and came to a place where I felt valued for who I was with my weird eccentricities and interests that, some of my friends in high school didn't necessarily have, and no one in my family really had. And I met people like me. But I think what it did was it really helped me to feel good about being who I was and to sort of let my geek out and shine, because it's actually a strength. And that's the one thing, even if I sort of don't come back to this point, that I really want to impart, is that wherever you go, is to find a community that accepts you as yourself, because that's the thing that's going to make it much easier to go down this road of being in STEM. And if you're a parent, it's really important that you encourage your children to sort of develop these interests, because they might be completely different from you. My mom kind of thinks I'm an alien. So I'm lucky that I found a community that was able to sort of help me feel good about myself in this way, because that's really one of the reasons why I feel comfortable and confident in what I do today. So yeah, Stanford helped me turn this, nerdy little, I don't know, ninth grader. I don't know if you can see, I think I probably still have braces at this point, into all of these identities. And so this is the thing, is that we're living in a time when we're not just Black, we're Black and, or we're female and, or we're queer or trans and. We have so many multiple identities that are sort of up and down our sleeve at any moment in time, right? So right now, being Black is probably the identity that it's the most important to me, just because of what's going on in the world. But tomorrow when I call my patients, being a psychiatrist is the identity that I wear. And I think that being able to sort of feel proud of who I am and all of, that makes me me, is one of the reasons why I'm able to navigate this complex world as a woman, a Black woman, and feel comfortable, even though most people in my field may not look like me. And so while I do credit Stanford, I also credit finding a group of people and having parents that are supportive so that you can embrace all of your identities, which include the ones that are on this long PowerPoint slide, right? So I'm like a millennial, but I'm really bad at technology. I'm Floridian, sort of a Southerner, but that doesn't really count. My appearance is soft butch, yet I identify as a cisgendered woman. I love the 80s. That sort of speaks for itself. I grew up middle class. I'm also my mother's child, and I'm a narcoleptic. And so these are all things that I've learned to embrace because of my past experiences. So the thing is that Stanford didn't really help me in that I didn't do well in the sciences when I was there. As you can imagine, it's a pretty competitive place to study. And so that's going to be the thing about college, right? So once you make it through high school, even if you're top of your class, you're going to get to college and there are going to be all these people who've been the top of their class. And, even though, there are not a ton of Black people or women in the sciences, just given the statistics, at Stanford, pre-med happened to be the most popular major. So I did not fare well compared to some of my classmates. And as it turns out, I started to realize how much I was kind of like, I don't know that I like the sciences, but I do want to be a doctor. So I've had to do some other things to, widen my application to actually get into medical school. Because, I'm competing with people who are getting A's and A+ in all of these classes. And this really got to me. It made me think maybe I actually don't want to be a doctor. I wouldn't be good at a doctor. Even though, I'd wanted to be a psychiatrist, which you still need to go to medical school for. I think that my grades were actually something that were really impacting my self-esteem at the time. How can you be at a college that's like, go nerd when you're getting C's? But I was blessed enough to encounter mentors who really helped me explore some of my other strengths and get back on the train and widen, again, broaden my application. So even if you may not get all A's, you have some other things that you can work with. So, for example, I got a master's degree. So while I took on that additional debt, it showed that I was serious in public health. I got a master's of public health, and I learned about the healthcare system and the doctor's role in the healthcare system before going to medical school. And I was able to show this is one of my interests. I'm really passionate about healthcare. I have a background. I want to go into public health. I also, I studied as much as I could, and I took the MCAT and got a really good score. Some of that had to do with being able to take an MCAT class. So this is going to be important when you're trying to go to medical school or graduate school. They have all these standardized tests, and unfortunately, they mean a big deal. But I think if you're someone who doesn't have the grades, that the test scores is a thing that can kind of help boost you up. But finding a way to pay for those tests are sometimes difficult. If you happen to know someone who's already a doctor or someone who's already in a position that you're trying to aim for, you might want to ask them to see if they'll help you cover the cost of the test. But there's sometimes some scholarship programs that can help with that too. Then lastly, extracurriculars, right? So I played rugby when I was in college. I was a resident assistant when I was in college. I had all these other experiences besides just studying for the sciences, which clearly I didn't do as well as I could have because I had a C. I had a lot of C's. But what I'm trying to show is that even though I may not have had some of the best grades, I was able to make up for it in other ways to show that I was a serious student. And in case you haven't noticed something, this slide looks a little bit like what my mother was having me do in high school. So that's a formula that worked for me, is that even though I may be weak in one area, I was able to bolster my strengths in other areas to say, here, even though I got this grades, I can actually test. I got a master's degree, I'm serious about it, and I'm well-rounded. I can contribute all of this to your institution. So these are important to consider as you're going into the STEM field, if you know that some of your scores or grades may not be as good as some of the other applicants who've had opportunities to help them get better scores. And I got into medical school. Then again, I moved to Chicago and spent 4 years trying to get through, winter, which was really tough, but I made it. Not only did I get into medical school, I got into residency. So after medical school, which is 4 years, then you apply to whatever specialty you want to apply to. And I'd already known that I wanted to do psychiatry. I was really interested in mental health and being, a naturally anxious sort of person all my life. And I matched at Yale and I moved to New Haven, where I completed 4 years of a psychiatry residency. But it's not easy, and I'm sure I've highlighted some of the difficulties. But again, this is a thing as a woman, when you grow up or you get older, if this is your daughter who we're talking about, is that you may be the only one of you like you in a classroom or in a field or in an office. And that can really get to you in some ways that I'm going to highlight. And I'm just want to highlight these to show you that these are experiences that I've had, and I want you to be on the lookout so that you can talk yourself through it and work your way through it with support. And so this is actually just me wanting to highlight that we're seeing even fewer and fewer Black people getting into the STEM fields. And that's with respect to, with race in this case. But I believe that there are at least more women who are getting into medical school and becoming doctors, which is a positive thing, but not necessarily Black women and Black people in the STEM field. So this is something to consider when you are looking to apply to these programs and how many of people who look like you are going to be there. There's a high risk of sort of feeling alone in moments like this. And some of these reasons are because of structural racism. So I know we're talking a lot about racism right now, but structural racism is sort of like, it's like the umbrella of what's causing not having so many women or Black people in STEM, right? So we talked a little bit about test scores, right? So if you imagine a system that was created for a certain kind of people, that means that the system was also created to work against some kind of people just by virtue of not being designed for them. And so just because of the way that our country in the United States is set up, the medical system, the legal system, the educational system, these are all designed to benefit white people as they were created by white people who founded our country and wrote our Constitution. It doesn't mean that every white person that you see around you feels the same way as the people who created the system. But it still doesn't change the fact that this is a system that our entire world is built on, right? So we all go to the same sort of schools, right? We might have charter schools now or private schools now or magnet schools, but they're all based, from the same rooted with the same interests. And so that's why sometimes it's for women, again, there were white men who built the system. So if you're anything else, you might have a harder time navigating the system. So you might have a hard time getting medical care because that system was not necessarily made to be optimal in Black neighborhoods, or the juvenile or the justice system, right? We see a large number of Black men who are in prison because the system was not created to imprison really white men. It's created to imprison people who commit crimes, but you can see that there are disparities with that. We have a lot of people who look like one certain thing and not the people who created the system. And the educational system, which I think is important to talk about here. It has to do with the fact of why some of us may have to go to schools that aren't in our neighborhood, why some of us have to be in classes with people who don't look like us, why some of us may have a hard time affording standardized tests to get into college or to get into graduate school, because we may not have gotten some of the opportunities in terms of education that other people may have gotten because of opportunities that they have had. It doesn't mean that, people all over don't work hard. There are just some things in the system that give people a boost to do a little bit better than other people because of how they look, which is unfortunate. And that's sometimes just being a woman or being a person of color. So we have to work against this system to kind of succeed. And it's tough. It's really tough. And one thing I want to encourage you is to, not get discouraged, or when you do get discouraged, to realize that it's a system It's not necessarily the people who are right in front of you. So here are some things I want you to look out for. So this is a big term. It's called learned helplessness, right? So this happens when you keep facing something negative or uncontrollable, when you're trying to change your circumstances or make it better. So this might be me studying as hard as I can when I was in college at Stanford, but I kept getting a C. Like nothing I was doing was, I was not getting a B or not getting an A. So I might as well just like give up, right? And so that's learned helplessness, right? I just assumed that I would never be able to do it. You just learn that you can't do it well. So what's the point? So this is one thing you have to avoid, right? You can't give up. So even though I, got these grades, I went on to a different graduate degree program and got better grades. And even in medical school, science was really tough for me, like biochemistry and physiology. These are things that, I understand, I had to understand, but they were tough. But I at least learned that I knew I had to do it and I could do it. So I couldn't give in to learned helplessness. So that's something to watch out for. Also, stereotype threat. So this was something that was actually a term that was coined by a researcher at Stanford. And it's when people believe or fear that they're going to act in a certain way that reinforces a stereotype. So for example, the big study was that women are, there was this sort of saying that women were bad at science or bad at math. And so they studied women taking a test and actually sort of told them, women are bad at taking math tests and science tests. And they found that the women actually did poor on the test when they were told this. So imagine we live in a world where we're told that girls can't do this and women can't do this, right? And then we go in and try to do the same things as men. And sometimes we fail because we've talked our own selves out of it. So not only that we haven't talked ourselves out of it, but society has told us all these messages that we're not good enough, and then we give into it. So you have to look out for stereotype threat, right? So what this looks like is I might consistently score lower on a test because I sit down and I think, well, I'm, this Black girl who gets C's on her test. I'm never going to get an A. So that's how something like this shows up. Then there's internalized racism, and this is acceptance by members of a race or a group of negative messages about their intrinsic worth. So this is sort of like the other term, right? Is that, well, I'm Black, we don't do well in science anyway. There are not that many Black doctors, so I'm not going to do that well anyway. And I start to feel bad about myself. I start to think that I'm not worth it. I start to think maybe I shouldn't be a doctor, right? These are some of the things I was feeling when I was struggling with science and struggling when I was in college. And so again, this looks like maybe I avoid hanging out. This is like a very special kind of circumstance of it, but it's like maybe I avoid hanging out with Black people because I don't want people to think that I'm like them. But in this case, it's like maybe I just feel so bad about myself when taking this test that I just might avoid doing it because Black people shouldn't be doctors. So why should I try to take the test or try to be a doctor? So don't give in to internalized racism or internalized homophobia or internalized sexism. These are all things that can happen based on one of your identities, right? It doesn't have to necessarily be your race. And then lastly, imposter syndrome, right? So this is when you feel like an imposter. An imposter is someone who doesn't belong. So you may doubt that you actually have accomplishments or talents, or you may feel like you're a fraud, right? Like you don't deserve what you have. Or like, oh, your success is luck. I actually kind of did this earlier when I said my 8th grade librarian found me by happenstance, right? I'd actually been getting good grades in 8th grade, even though it's a long time ago. That's how she identified me. But I downplayed that because maybe I don't think I was that special back then. And this is something that women and girls tend to do with their accomplishments is we downplay them like they're not important. And then, we feel like we don't belong in these places when we get raises or we get promoted or we get into these great colleges, right? And so it also looks like maybe you avoid asking a question because you worry that you'll come off as like less intelligent or you'll mispronounce words or like your idea isn't good enough anyway. It's just gonna get shot down. You really don't feel like you belong. And the truth is that if you've gotten those grades, if you got accepted, if you got those test scores, if you wrote those essays, if you were granted admission to a place, you deserve to be there just as much as anyone else. You can't let someone tell you that just because of how you look, that you got in on some kind of special sort of program. Everyone brings something different to the table. And I really want to encourage people to keep keep sight of all of the special things you bring, even if they look different than other people, to opportunities, because people will see that and they'll let you into their medical schools. They'll accept you into their colleges. But you have to know what you're bringing to the table. So if I had to come up with 3 take-home tidbits or pieces of advice, my advice is to play your own game, right? I think there's a lot of comparison that happens, right? Not just with personal stuff, like, am I as cute or am I as smart as other people? But like, maybe I don't have enough money as other people. Maybe I don't have a nice interview suit like the other people on the interview trail who are interviewing for medical school. But you have to just have confidence in what you have, as you're going through your academic future, right? So I would recommend take chances, but not the kind of chances that will bankrupt you or get you in jail or get you beat up. I mean, take chances. I moved across the country. I grew up in Florida and moved to Palo Alto, California for college. That's a huge risk, being away from my parents, not having that many family around. Again, that was a chance that I could take because of loans and the way that my financial situation was. But if you talk yourself out of taking a chance that might be good for you, you might miss out on an opportunity when there really might not be that many cons to the opportunity. Also, know your weaknesses, right? I think the weakness that I've been talking a lot about is that I don't test well in science. So as a result of knowing that, I walk into interviews, and if someone asks me, well, what about these scores or what about these grades? I was able to explain, it's not necessarily my strength. I have to work really hard, but I do get a basic level of understanding. It may not be that I test well, right? But you know what I can do? I'm a great people person. I know how to listen. I know how to talk to people. I know the background of the healthcare system. I got a master's in public health. So be prepared. Don't shy away from those weaknesses, but also don't lean into them. You don't want to overemphasize or just be bogged down by all the things that you're bad at, but you do want to balance with your strengths and lead with those and sell yourself with those because you have strengths, right? Also, just love and accept yourself. And I think that this was something that was difficult for me to do, which is normal, especially as a teenager and as someone in their 20s, and even now sometimes, right? But I think finding a community, and this happened for me when I went to college, that accepted me for liking, electronic music or dressing in bright neon colors or pastels, right? Or for wearing weird glasses, is that you're the one who has to live this life and walk in your shoes for the rest of your life. You might as well do the things that make you happy. And I think that, this is one that is definitely probably the toughest to do, but it makes your day-to-day easier. And you know what? You show up at work, you show up at school being yourself, and other people notice that and they want to be around it because they realize how much you love and accept yourself. And they see that maybe you'll love and accept them just as much. So those are my pieces of advice. And I hope that this was useful.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cyrus. That was such a fantastic talk. Speaking as somebody who works in the technology industry, I feel like I've picked up a lot of useful skills that sometimes I'm not always super cognizant of, like you tend to undersell yourself, and it's this constant reminder process of, no, don't undersell yourself, believe in your abilities, harness your power, and come away much better for it, right?
Right.
So, so thank you. Awesome talk. So I wanted to ask a couple questions on behalf of our audience members. So the first one, in the past, you have spoken about how narcolepsy has affected your personal health and your career. For audience members who might not be familiar with narcolepsy, it is a sleep disorder characterized by intense drowsiness that is not always noticeable to other people. Could you talk about how suffering from an invisible disability has affected you? And for our audience members who may also be affected by a less visible disability, do you have any advice on the best way to approach the subject in the workplace?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think it's been tough because a part of me feels like, oh, well, you don't have a severe form of narcolepsy. Like you don't have, I can stereotypically, we think of people who have narcolepsy as like sort of passing out when either laughing or getting really happy. But what I do have, which has been difficult, is that I can fall asleep so easily. And so looking back, I fell asleep a lot in high school. I couldn't go to class really in medical school because I would just fall asleep all day in the lecture hall. So I had to watch lectures on my own. in a really sort of simulating environment. And then when I got to residency, and remember, I'm a psychiatrist, I sit with patients, and I was getting so sleepy. It was so hard to stay awake. Even in my lectures, I even got written on one of my evaluations, Callie sleeps too much. So I think that in these cases, not telling someone was actually harmful to me, because then it just looked like I was a poor performer. And I think that's the thing with if you have some kind of disability that people may not be able to recognize, is that you're so used to overcompensating with it that you may not let people know that there's actually something going on with you. And so when I finally did, I was able to, for example, one really, really important consequence was that I was actually able to get more time on one of my tests. And so this is the thing, is that these standardized tests like are 8 hours, right, to take the medical board. So that's a long time to have to stare at a screen. And I would get tired, even though I would have adrenaline. There'd always be a point after lunch where I just want to crash. So I was actually able to take my test in 2 days. And it was the best I've ever done on an exam as a result of asking for it. So I think my advice is, is to, if you realize that it's impacting your performance, it's best to privately talk to somebody about it to see what kind of accommodations you can get. And I do understand that some people may live or work in circumstances where this may hurt them. So I recommend going to the Office of Disabilities, where you can tell them confidentially, and then they don't have to let sort of the rest of your work environment or some of your colleagues. It's not like they'll be gossiping about that kind of stuff, but you'll at least get it on the record. And then you can start asking for a way to help, because you want to be able to show up and be the best you. And there are things and sort of policies put in place to allow us to do that. It's just a matter of like feeling comfortable and safe enough to do so. And so I think the first place to start is a confidential source, like an office, that this is responsible for helping you, get through it. And I think these days, I'm at a point where I have more control over my schedule, and I'm actually able to take a nap twice a day. I can take a 20-minute nap at 11 a.m. I can take a 20-minute nap at 3 o'clock. And I've been able to, find some really good doctors who are prescribing medications that help me stay awake and be more effective.
Thank you. So our second question is, so certainly this was touched on quite a bit in your presentation. Outside of the presentation as well, and just in your in the other areas that you speak about in your career, you frequently talked about implicit and explicit bias within the medical industry. I mentioned that I personally work in tech, and we're also plagued with biases against women, non-binary folks, and ethnic minorities. And I think for technology, many of these systemic biases can be attributed to being in a non-diverse work environment that rewards conforming to stereotypes that have been traditionally associated with white or sometimes even Asian men. And so I'm interested in learning a little bit about what this looks like in the medical industry. So within your industry, what do you attribute to the origin of systemic biases? Have you felt pressure to conform to these biases yourself? And do you have any advice for young women or non-binary medical students to combat biases while still staying positive about their own identity?
Yeah, so I think that I would attribute it to the way that the system is created and who's in leadership. So this is the thing, is that we all sort of, whether we want to or not, we follow the lead of those who come before us. And when you have something like a medical system, a legal system, educational system that was created, again, with white men as the norm, there are all these weird norms that are built into the system where if you're not a white man, it doesn't come to you naturally, right? We have to try to emulate or look like the people the system was made for to get ahead. And so that's why, we may dress a certain way, right? We may speak a certain way. We may prioritize certain things in public that we may not in private. And so for me, I'm like as far opposite as you can be for a white man. I'm like a Black, queer, butch looking woman. And I think it really impacts people differently on what that thing is that really gets them, that they feel this pressure to conform. So I think for me, it's been appearance has been something that I've sort of fought back on conforming, right? So for me, what I wear is a huge part of how I feel, how I express my sort of individuality. And medicine is a pretty conservative world, right? Like men wear suit and ties. Women are typically, are usually in like a skirt suit or something like that for interviews. And I've gradually, I think some of the choices I've made have reflected my resistance to conforming. So first of all, I'm a psychiatrist. Psychiatrists we are known as not wearing white coats as often. So that's automatically like one step down on how conservative our dress may be. A lot of us work in the community as well, where I can wear more casual clothes. Not we all, but a lot of psychiatrists, if you think of Sigmund Freud, he had these little round glasses and blazers with the patches on them. So it just so happens that like, I think psychiatrists are pretty stylish. Like I've been able to I can wear the funny glasses and it comes out. And then the rest of it has kind of just been taking chances. So I've worn a bow tie before. I've worn a bolo tie. And, I went to a point where I also have really bad feet. I actually had foot surgery about 10 years ago. And so I pride myself on wearing comfortable shoes. And I was able to actually sneak in wearing like Converses sometimes because most people aren't really looking at your feet in that way. So I'd say that what I've done is I've taken chances. Because if you really think about it, very rarely, I would say, have I ever been chastised for what I'm wearing. So some of it is also just being able to push the envelope in small ways that you can. And as you get more and more senior, you realize like if you set an example of feeling confident in what you're doing, and if someone wants to come to you to say, why aren't you wearing this? And you have an explanation. And also the one thing that is very important, if you're on top of it, people can't complain about anything. I used to have a mentor, he's since passed away, but his name is Carl Bell. And he wore cowboy hats and sunglasses everywhere. He was a psychiatrist. He would give a speech in sunglasses and a cowboy hat. And I asked him, I said, how do you get away with this? And he said, you got to be on top of it. Someone's going to say something to me about what I'm wearing when I'm doing like an amazing job. So, I mean, that it carries a level of confidence, but I think you have to be comfortable with taking risks, even if it's a little small one, right? And seeing what happens. But you realize how often you won't get negative feedback. A lot of it is your worry of what happens when you don't conform, right? But there are some things that you just will have to do. And those are unfortunate. But I think that especially if you're non-binary, this world, it's not, the world of medicine is not created for you. So I think that's going to be speaking up and asking for allowances, or sometimes taking them and seeing the negative feedback that happens and knowing when to challenge it when it's unfair. So you really have to be able to fight for yourself too, is another thing.
Yeah, and I completely agree about especially dressing in a way that makes you feel comfortable with who you are, because I feel like that's really the first step to finding comfort in your work environment, or finding comfort in a place which maybe hasn't been traditionally accepting towards your identity. If you aren't able to feel good about yourself on the inside, which often, if you're forced to dress in a way that I don't identify with, that's something that might happen for you. So if you're not able to dress in that way, then I think that's just all the more challenging to try to overcome. Completely agree.
Yeah.
So our next question, with the current state of the world, I think that many of us can relate to feeling a lot more lethargic and maybe even less motivated than normal. I personally have always been a goal-oriented person, but these days, sometimes I even struggle to get out of bed. You have a really great video series called The Rona Rage, which I'm going to link in the video, about helping people to cope during coronavirus. So how do you manage to get out of bed in the morning? And are there any strategies that you have staying motivated right now towards some of your goals?
Yeah. And this is a tough one. I think the first thing I recommend is acknowledging when you're having a hard time getting out of bed. So often we're like, oh, what's wrong? Like, I should be better than this. Like, I just need to get out of bed. And the first step is just saying, you know what? I'm having a hard time getting out of bed, and that's okay. And that is so hard to do. It's easier said than done, right? Like, I don't know how many Buddhism books I have to read. I don't know how many times my therapist has to tell me this. Accept it, right? You don't have to judge it. Sometimes it's hard to get out of bed. The world is like chaotic. It's on fire, literally. It makes perfect sense that you don't want to get out of bed. And even if it wasn't on fire, sometimes it's hard to get out of bed, and that's okay. So acknowledging it and trying to acknowledge it without judgment is I think the number one thing, and it's also probably one of the more challenging. So for me, I have to trick myself. And I think one of my, I'll say, is a negative coping strategy is guilt. And that's something that I'm actively trying to work against. It's like I guilt myself. Well, if you don't get out of bed, then you're not gonna you're not gonna be able to work out. And then who knows what the rest of your day is gonna look like. So what I've done is I just try to preemptively do, like, what are the reasons why I may not want to get out of bed? Some of it is that I'm tired. So I try to go to sleep at a decent hour. I try to turn my phone off or put it away from me an hour before bed. I try not to use the bath or drink too much water before bed. So I try to anticipate and kind of get ahead of it, the reasons why I might not want to do something. The other thing I might do is I might reach out to a friend. Like if I realize there's been multiple days of not being able to get out of bed, I'm just feeling really unmotivated, then I start to say, what are the things that I haven't done to recharge myself? And one of those is usually socializing with someone who makes me laugh or someone who makes me feel good about myself. And I think it's really easy. We're on Zoom all day, probably texting our friends all day, or we might make phone calls. But how often do we actually call your best friend or a friend from years ago and have a FaceTime visit with them? Something that and just talk about anything, someone that makes you feel good. And so I think it's really important to reconnect with people who make you feel good in this way and really push yourself to do so. It's tough. You're like, oh, I'm on the Zoom all day. Well, last thing I want to do is another FaceTime call. But when you do it, you inevitably feel better, right? I think the other thing I do is sometimes stay in bed. Sometimes you need to stay in bed. You got to give in. It's like, what's the harm? And even sometimes if there is the harm, every now and then, maybe you take a mental health day if you can, right? Again, I have the privilege of being able to do that with my schedule. So I don't know if this applies to everyone, but sometimes you have to give in to that urge. Your body is probably trying to tell you something that you need to stay in bed. So I think sometimes you do have to give in. I think the next thing is that you have to create, little tricks. So if this is something I tell my patients who like maybe don't want to get out of bed, this is a stretch here, but maybe have some sort of drinking or alcohol problem with everything that's going on. So let's say you have a vice that you're really trying to get past. Come up with creative ways to get through it. So if you know that you stay up too late, or you're going to eat a box of cookies or something late at night, brush your teeth really early. Brush your teeth right out of dinner, or drink seltzer water instead of beer or instead of alcohol. Put the alarm across the room, right? Like even if these little things may not work at first, they're gonna get annoying and they're worth trying. So get creative about putting roadblocks, I think, to giving into some of these habits when you know you're having a hard time doing that. And then the last thing is asking for help. So not just maybe reaching out to friends, but a lot of insurance companies right now are being more lenient with what they cover for therapy. And I know a lot of Obamacare and Medicaid plans have also expanded your ability to sign up for them. And so if it's time to see a therapist, if it's time to see a psychiatrist, that's okay. It makes sense that this would be the time to see one because so much is going on. So I think if that means maybe you need to ask for help if something's not quite right, then it's okay. You don't hurt by asking for help in this way.
Kind of as a quick follow-up to that question, are there any goals or projects that you're currently working towards right now?
Yeah, I am. So I think I have to wear many hats. So I see patients 3 days a week. I see them in the community. And I also, on one day on Saturdays, I see them through telepsych. And then I've started doing more consulting than I used to do before. It was just little projects here and there. So I try to give myself a day to work on consulting projects. And I think the project that I'm most excited about doing is trying to make some more videos, educational videos. One thing I've realized is how there's not a lot of money in the system, not a lot of attention to explaining how policy impacts us in real life. Most people just want to spend money on advertising. So I'm really interested in taking complex material that is not sort of disseminated in accessible ways to people and making educational videos about it. So I've made now this video about racism and its impact on COVID-19. I made another about just being like sad and how to interact with your Black friends during this time. And I'm working on one where I'm hoping to connect some of the tenets of the stimulus bill with what it looks like in real life, right? So one proposal for the stimulus bill from the Republican side was that you, instead of getting $600 a week for unemployment, you get $200. And so actually like connecting that in a way that feels a bit less partisan, but like a long arrow or something with a little animated person who brings home a checkbook of $200 versus $600. So I've been trying to read and figure out what's the most interesting and the most relevant to sort of share with people to help educate them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Callie Cyrus. Sincerely appreciate having you present with Geek Girl Con today. Love the presentation, love the questions and answers. If our audience members are interested in learning more about you or your practice, what's the best way for them to learn more?
Yeah, so they can find me at my website, which is www.calliedcmd.com. And there's a way to send me a message on there too. And they can also follow me on Twitter.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You're welcome. Thanks.